They say that trust is the most dangerous gift you can give someone. My father once trusted a friend, and it changed everything for me. Growing up, my life was a constant shuffle between two homes. My dad, Herschel Rousseau, is a businessman who's always on the move, sharp, ambitious, and always chasing the next deal. He has built a career that has seen him on planes and in boardrooms more than at home. He's divorced, and although he hasn't remarried, he's always made sure I'm looked after. When he's around, it feels like he's trying to cram a month's worth of attention into a few short days. And when he's gone, I just have to figure out how to cope. My mother, Caroline Zimmerman, remarried Greg Carlson years ago. Greg is a good man, thoughtful, stable, and always trying to include me. Together they have two small children who bring life and chaos to their home. It's a happy home, warm and full of laughter, but I can't help but feel out of place. My mum tries her best to make me feel at home, and so does Greg. But there's something about being in their space that makes me feel like an outsider, like I'm squeezed into a picture where I don't quite belong. On short trips, when Dad is away for a day or two, I usually stay at home alone. I don't mind, I enjoy the silence. It's like putting a pause on all the chaos. But when his trips last a week or more, things get more complicated. My mum's house is the logical choice, but being there always feels like I'm tiptoeing around, trying not to disrupt her routine. It's no one's fault, really. It's just the reality of living between two worlds. This was my normal: two homes, two parents, and a constant effort to keep it all in balance. But sometimes life has a way of throwing something unexpected at you, and that's where this story really begins. Before we dive into this part of the story, I just want to say, if you're as hooked as I hope you are, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It helps so much, and your support means the world to me. So let's get back to the story. My dad doesn't trust easily. Maybe it's all the traveling, or the businesses he's seen fall apart, or the people who've let him down over the years. But there was one person who stood out: Colton Cohen. Colton was one of Dad's oldest friends, someone he could count on no matter what. They'd known each other for years, long before I was even born. Colton wasn't just a friend, he was family. A digital marketing guy with a knack for creating content, Colton spent most of his time in front of screens, always working on something new. Like my dad, he was divorced, lived alone, and threw himself into his work. And like my dad, Colton was someone I'd always seen as dependable, stable, and safe. We didn't visit Colton often, but when we did, it was always the same. He'd greet us with an easy smile, a firm handshake for Dad, and a kind word for me. His house was simple but inviting, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. You could tell he lived alone, no clutter, no noise, just a quiet, organized life. One day, Dad and I stopped by Colton's house for what I thought would be a quick visit. Dad said he had some time before his next meeting, so he wanted to catch up with Colton and relax a bit. It was nice to sit in Colton's living room and watch them reminisce and tell stories. For a moment, it felt as if everything was perfectly normal. But as the sun sank lower in the sky, Dad's phone rang. Work, as always, had called him away unexpectedly. I could see the hesitation on his face as he looked at me. It was late, and the thought of driving me home only to turn around and go to his meeting was clearly weighing on him. Before he could decide, Colton intervened. "She can stay here tonight," Colton offered. "It's no trouble at all. I've got a guest room and you can pick her up first thing in the morning." Dad looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I nodded. It seemed like the easiest solution, less stress for him, and it was just one night. Colton had always been nice, and I'd never had any reason to feel uncomfortable around him. I agreed, thinking it was no big deal. Dad thanked Colton, hugged me, and promised to be back early. As I watched his car disappear down the street, I didn't realize that decision would be the start of something I would never forget. Colton's house had always felt like a safe, quiet retreat. He lived on the outskirts of town, in a small, cozy neighborhood where every house had a neatly trimmed lawn and an air of tranquility about it, the kind of place where the loudest noise was the occasional barking dog or the hum of someone's lawnmower. This day was no different. After Dad left, Colton and I sat in the living room for a while, chatting about random things. He asked me about school, what shows I was into, and if I'd been following any trends online. It was casual, the kind of small talk that fills in the blanks in an unfamiliar environment. Colton was always easy to talk to, never too serious, but never dismissive. His calm, relaxed demeanor gave you the feeling that you could talk to him about anything without judgment. However, he spent most of his time at his desk, typing away at his computer. The soft clicking of his keyboard became the background music for the evening. Every now and then he'd turn around in his chair and ask me something, like what I wanted for dinner, or if I needed anything. I told him I was fine. I wasn't quite comfortable yet. I barely knew him. But he was making an effort, and I appreciated that. At one point, he offered to order takeaway. "I don't cook much," he admitted with a laugh, "but there's this great place nearby that does amazing burgers. You'll love it." I nodded, happy to have something to look forward to. While we waited for the food, I wandered around the house, admiring the little things that told me more about Colton's life. There were shelves of books on marketing, a few framed photos of him with my dad, and even some gadgets I couldn't even begin to name. Everything about his room felt efficient, as if every object had a purpose. Dinner arrived and we ate in the kitchen. Colton cracked a few jokes about how terrible he was at cooking, and I found myself laughing despite my nerves. He had a way of putting you at ease, as if you didn't have to try too hard to keep up a conversation. It wasn't until the meal was over and the plates were cleared that the atmosphere began to change. Colton grabbed a beer from the fridge and offered me a soda. "Can you handle a Coke?" he asked, holding up a can. I nodded and took the drink without thinking much about it. He leaned against the bar and sipped his beer as he asked me more questions. What I wanted to do after school, if I had ever thought about working online like him. He was genuinely curious, and most of the time I felt comfortable answering. But as he poured himself another drink, his tone started to change. "You know," he said, swirling the beer in his glass, "you've really grown up. I remember when you were just a little kid, always hiding behind your father's leg whenever you met someone new." I smiled awkwardly, not sure how to respond. The compliment felt odd, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. He laughed it off and changed the subject to something else, a show he thought I might like, but the words lingered in the back of my mind. As the clock struck 9, I was ready to call it a day. Colton noticed me looking at the clock and asked, "Are you tired? Want me to make up the guest room?" I nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape the strange tension that had begun to build. He led me upstairs and showed me the small, tidy room where I would sleep. The bed was already made with crisp white sheets and a soft grey blanket. "The bathroom's just down the hall," he said, pointing. "If you need anything, just shout. I'll be downstairs working for a while." I thanked him, closed the door, and exhaled. Finally, some space to breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to shake the uneasy feeling I couldn't quite explain. But as the night wore on, the house seemed to grow quieter and quieter, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clinking of bottles and the hum of Colton's voice talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cheerful, almost playful. It wasn't until the call ended and the silence returned that I felt something shift again. The silence wasn't soothing anymore, it was heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. The silence stretched on, pressing against me like a weight. I tried to shake it off. Colton was probably just concentrating on work or had gone to bed early. But as the minutes ticked by, something felt wrong. I couldn't hear the soft clatter of his keyboard, no faint hum of his voice, just silence, thick and disconcerting. I told myself I was thinking too much, but curiosity, or perhaps concern, got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, the cool floorboards creaking softly under my bare feet, and made my way to the stairs. The house was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the nightlight in the hallway. As I descended, I noticed the faint scent of alcohol in the air. When I reached the bottom, I found him. Colton was slumped on the couch, a half-empty bottle of beer in his hand, his head back against the cushions. A muted late-night talk show was flickering on the TV, casting an uneven shadow over his face. He looked completely out of it, as if he'd drunk himself into a stupor. My first instinct was to leave him there. It wasn't my problem. But something stopped me. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the thought of Dad trusting him to look after me. "Colton," I called quietly, standing a few meters away. He didn't react. His eyes fluttered open briefly, glassy and unfocused, before closing again. I hesitated, then moved closer, trying to gently shake him awake. "Colton, you shouldn't be sleeping here. Let me help you to your room." He mumbled something incoherent, his voice deep and slurred. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear he wasn't fully aware of what was happening. Carefully, I grabbed his arm and tried to lift him. He was heavier than I had expected, his weight almost pulling me down as I guided him to stand. "Come on," I urged, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was racing. "Let's get you to bed." We stumbled towards his room, his feet dragging slightly with each step. He was mumbling again, a mix of words that didn't make sense. Something about work, something about Dad, and then, "You're beautiful." The words hit me like a slap, sharp and disorientating. I froze for a second, unsure if I'd heard him right. But before I could react, he laughed, a low, drunken chuckle, and stumbled towards me. "So grown up," he slurred, his face inches from mine. "Colton, stop," I said firmly, trying to steady him without letting him get too close. "You're drunk. Let's just get you to bed." But he didn't stop. His hands, clumsy and unsteady, found their way to my shoulders and pulled me closer. I tried to push him away, but he was stronger than I had expected in his drunken state. His face was so close now, his breath heavy with the smell of alcohol. Before I could move, he pressed his lips to mine. Panic shot through me like lightning. I twisted my body and pulled away from him as fast as I could. "Colton, no!" I shouted, my voice shaking, but his grip didn't loosen. His hands moved to my waist, fumbling and desperate as he tried to pull me closer. I pushed him hard, my adrenaline surging as I managed to break free. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear and anger. He stumbled back, dazed and confused, muttering something I couldn't make out. Without another word, I ran. My feet pounded against the stairs as I raced back to the safety of my room. I slammed the door behind me and locked it with shaking hands. My heart was racing, my chest tight with a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. I collapsed onto the bed, hugging my knees to my chest as tears streamed down my face. What had just happened? How could someone I trusted, if only because Dad trusted him, do such a thing? I felt sick, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but none of them had answers. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and restless exhaustion. I stayed locked in my room, jumping at every sound, every creak of the house. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The days after that night felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest or the echo of his words in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that moment. His slurred voice, the way he grabbed me, the panic rushing through me. I wanted to forget, to bury it somewhere deep down where it couldn't hurt me anymore. But it wasn't that easy. Dad picked me up early the next morning, just as Colton had promised. I sat quietly the whole way home, staring out the window and nodding to his usual questions. "How was your night?" "Did you sleep well?" He seemed so at ease, so unaware, and I didn't have the heart to disturb that peace. So I said nothing. For a week I carried the secret alone, letting it gnaw at me from the inside. I told myself it was better that way, that telling Dad would only make things worse. He trusted Colton. They were friends, close friends. What would he even say? What would he do? But the weight of it all was unbearable, and one night it finally came out. "Dad," I began, my voice shaking as I sat across from him in the living room. He looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed at the tone of my voice. "I need to tell you something about Colton." At first I could see the confusion on his face, but as I described what had happened that night, the confusion turned to disbelief and then anger. I tried to keep my voice calm, but the tears came anyway, falling hot and fast as I recounted each detail. By the time I finished, his hands were clenched into fists, his jaw clenched with rage. "He did what?" he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "And you waited so long to tell me?" I didn't know how, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to ruin things between the two of you. I thought it would just make things worse." Dad didn't say much after that. He stood up abruptly and paced the room, as if trying to contain the storm brewing inside him. "I trusted him," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I trusted him with you." The next few days were tense. Dad barely spoke, his anger simmering just below the surface. I could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal. Colton had been more than a friend to him, he'd been like a brother. And now that bond had been broken. 2 weeks later, Colton showed up on our doorstep. I wasn't home when it happened, but Dad told me about it afterwards. Colton had come to apologize, his voice heavy with regret as he admitted everything. "I haven't seen you in days," he'd said. "I know why, and I can't live with myself if I don't make it right." He told Dad he'd given up drinking since that night and swore he'd never touch another drop. He said that moment had been a wake-up call, a mirror held up to the worst parts of himself. "I'm sorry," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I'll never forgive myself for what I did, to her or to you." Dad accepted the apology, but things were never the same. I could see it in the way he talked about Colton, or rather didn't talk about him. Their friendship, once effortless and trusting, became distant and strained. They stopped seeing each other, stopped calling each other. The easy camaraderie they had shared was gone, replaced by an invisible wall that neither of them seemed able to cross. And I couldn't help feeling guilty. Guilty for telling Dad, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. Guilty for being the reason that trust was broken, for the friendship that was lost. I'd never meant to cause all this. I just wanted to feel safe again. But safety came at a price, and it was one I couldn't ignore. Dad tried to hide it, but I knew he was struggling. He couldn't bear the thought of what Colton had done, to me and to their friendship. And neither could I. The weight of it all stayed with me, a constant reminder of how one moment could ripple out and change everything. Even now I can't help but wonder, did I do the right thing when I told my dad what had happened? I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to destroy a friendship that meant so much to him. I just couldn't keep it in anymore. But seeing the pain in his eyes, watching the bond between him and Colton fall apart, I started to question myself. Was there another way? Could I have done things differently, or was this the only way I could go? On the one hand, I was relieved. I'd carried this moment around with me like a weight, and telling Dad was the only way I could finally breathe again. But on the other hand, I felt guilty. So guilty. I'd taken something from my dad, something he treasured. And now I can't help but wonder if the price of my peace was too high. What would you have done in my place? Would you have kept it to yourself? Would you have tried to confront Colton directly? Or would you have done exactly what I did and told my dad, knowing it could break his heart? It's not an easy question, and I don't think there's a perfect answer. But I do know this. Sometimes doing what feels right can still leave you with questions. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try to fix things, the pieces don't fit back together the way they used to. And sometimes you just have to live with the choices you make, even if they hurt. If my story made you think, if it moved you in any way, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support means more than I can say, and it helps me continue to share stories like this with all of you. But more than that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done? Leave your comments below. I want to know what you think. As for me, I'm still figuring it all out. I'm still learning how to carry the weight of that night, how to forgive myself for the fallout, and how to move on. Maybe I'll never have all the answers, but for now, I'll hold on to this. I did what I thought was right at the time, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough.